So as much as possible, kind of, bring it in a little bit. We're kind of doing this a little bit town hall style-ish. And so the way that will work is that we're going to use, I keep wanting to say Speedo, Slido. So sad, I'm giving away my age. Speedo, Slido. So we'll use Slido. So if you want to pose some questions that way, you can, as well as those who are watching online. And but then also, if you want, you can just come up to these microphones here and pose questions as well. So you can feel free to do that. I'm just going to have a few brief comments, but the entire purpose of this session is to just hear and for me to be able to respond and for us to just have a conversation. Ideally about this idea of building the next Sphinx. So already be, if you're thinking of questions or have them, you can already feel free to post them, or you can even begin to come up to microphones. So the reason why we thought about this session and about having it, and when I was talking with the Sphinx team about this, is the idea that there is going to be a next Sphinx, right? There's going to be other organizations. There already are many organizations already started by alums. And some of those organizations and those projects, those initiatives are going to have a profound impact on the field. And some of those will have an even more profound impact than Sphinx is even having already. And some of those of you who are in the room or watching online are going to be the ones who start those organizations. And so one of the things that Sphinx wants to do is to be a catalyst for all of those additional ventures and be able to provide support, be able to provide ideas, et cetera. So the goal for this session is to be able to hopefully provide some feedback that I can about how you might go about that. Now, some of you may be at a point where you don't have an organization yet, you're not about to launch an organization, you may be a junior semifinalist, but you're thinking already about some ideas, but you're not sure how to think about those ideas or how to develop them, or how do I even take an idea and bring it to some fruition? Where do I start? What would I do? And some others of you may already have an organization that you've built over several years and you're looking to take it to the next level, those types of things, and thinking about those challenges. So what I want to try and do in this conversation is just share any of the experiences that I had developing Sphinx, as well as a host of other projects, and both the failures and the successes, and share whatever information and experiences that I've had that could be helpful for you as you go about this journey of ideally building what will be the next Sphinx. There's IBM, and IBM, right, was the big, kind of tech company and so on and so forth. But IBM could not be Facebook, Twitter, Microsoft, et cetera. All of those came about. And so hopefully Sphinx will be there for the long term and be able to be a sense and a resource for many organizations for decades and beyond to come. But the goal is that we will add to the tapestry, to the mosaic, to the ecosystem of organizations that are impacting people's lives. And those may or may not have a focus on diversity or inclusion. So you want to think about that. There's a host of different projects that I've launched and started that don't have a focus on diversity or inclusion. They have other particular impacts that I want to be able to have in society. So that's the goal for our time here that we have, a little less than an hour, so it's not too much time. So try to be as judicious as possible with your questions in terms of don't have them be too long so that hopefully I can respond to them, but respond to as many questions as possible. So why don't we start over here, and then we'll just go back and forth, and then occasionally go to Slido. So yes.
Hi, thank you for having this panel.
Yeah.
So at the opening plenary, I was highly inspired by what you were talking about with dice. And as you went through each letter of DICE, I felt like, okay, diversity, I'm there. Innovation, I'm doing it. Creativity, yes, I have that. But when you got to entrepreneurship, that's when I started thinking, well, maybe I'm not quite hitting the mark there. So my question is, what role, in your opinion and from your perspective, does personal capital have in entrepreneurship and starting the projects you want to create? How important is it to have a personal level of financial freedom when trying to start an entrepreneurial project?
Great question. And I was going to ask you right off the bat about whether you were talking about actual personal capital and money and funds that you have available. So my short answer is that you don't necessarily need any to be able to start. And there are a number of ventures and projects that I have launched with absolutely no money, and especially the earlier ones, because I just had no money. And so, for example, I was absolutely, had no resources, had been evicted from an apartment, didn't have a car, and had almost been homeless, and had friends who were homeless who had stayed with us. And so I was like, this issue of homelessness is really a problem, so I need to start an organization to fix it. So I did, without a car and without resources and so on and so forth. Now, ultimately, that project, the Jumpstart organization, didn't have long-term sustainability for a host of reasons, including just other entrepreneurial skill sets that I didn't necessarily have at the time. But the experience that I had building that organization and the connections and the network that I made just through that process empowered me to be able to do other projects. So absent of that experience, I never would have been able to start Sphinx. So I think as you're thinking about ideas, realize that even if the idea that you're working on doesn't come to fruition, the process of doing it can be of extraordinary benefit and may lead to places that you might not even expect. A very quick story about that I'll just share relates to Robin Williams. So as the last ditch effort, this homeless organization was just not working. We weren't getting any funding. And how are we going to be able to continue? Because the focus was transitional housing, which was much more important than emergency food and shelter at the time in terms of where we were working on it. And so I figured, let me just send out a letter to these celebrities and see if anyone responds. And one of the people I wrote to was Robin Williams, because he had demonstrated a history in supporting issues surrounding homelessness. So about a month later, I get a phone call, think it's bill collectors, pay your bills, da da da. And it's Marsha Williams. And she says, I'm calling about a letter to my husband. Ended up talking to her. Now, this was after I had to drop out of Penn State, and so owed all of these loans and so on and so forth. And now the organization had to close because there was nothing we could do to be able to keep it going. So literally having this conversation with her pretty much about my failures in life. But I didn't see them as failures, but that is kind of what I was describing. Yep, this organization I wrote to you about, it's closing, couldn't keep it going. Yeah, and was at Penn State and, gave my recitals and so on and so forth, but had to drop out. But we can't get back into Michigan because we have all of these student loans and so on and so forth. But it was this amazing conversation. And she said, well, why don't you send Robin and I copies of your student loans? We'll see what we can do. And, let's just go from there. So I was like, oh my God, of course, So we send all these copies of loans that were in default to Penn State as well as federal loans. And then we end up getting evicted from that apartment, getting into a new apartment. And then I got a job in the mailroom of a marketing company. And my partner at the time got a job as a receptionist at a law firm. So for the first time, we had a little bit of financial stability, personal stability. And 1 month later, got a letter from the Joel Faden Financial Companies. And in it said, enclosed, please find checks made out in your behalf from Robin Williams' account. And they had paid off all of our loans to Penn State, which freed up our transcripts, which was the only way that I was able to apply to University of Michigan to be able to get back in and get back to my music and to my violin, which I was desperately missing. And they caught all of our federal loans up out of default. And
would you mind if I sent you my student loan balance?
Yes, yes. Nice, I love it. That's innovation right there. So little did I know that from that, what some people might look as failure, built a relationship that continued until his passing. And he was one of also the first supporters of Sphinx through his actual foundation, the Windfall Foundation. So you never know where things are going to lead. So I would say absolutely do not, it's great to have personal capital, but it is absolutely not a stopper whatsoever. And there's in-kind partners that you can use. There's people that you can go and ask for. There's GoFundMe and a host of online resources to try to bring people together. So there's a host of ways to try to build that. So sorry to make such a long-winded question. I'll try and answer them quicker, but great question. So yes, Elena.
This sort of segues out of that, but again, on the subject of finances, at least when I was in music school, we did not have a class that was like fundraising 101. So what would you tell someone looking to start a venture? Like, how do you fundraise? Either vague or specific, or just what do you do?
Yeah, great question. So, so there are a number of things to do. Number one that I would first say is start doing something or anything. I can't count the number of times that people ask me about things related to entrepreneurship or those types of things. And my first question is, well, what have you done so far? And they haven't done anything yet. So until you're doing a host of things and it just turns out that the things you're doing somehow aren't working or aren't wrong, then I'm like, so is this actually about doing something, or is it about figuring out the right things to do? So that's just a first thing. Secondarily to fundraising, in some ways there is both a science and also not a science to it. So the not part science of it is just to simply ask everyone and everything you know for money. And by that, what I mean is anybody online, any of your friends, any people you know who might have resources. The worst thing anyone's going to do is say, I'm sorry, no. I mean, that's the worst thing. So, and if you're going to be an entrepreneur, if you're going to be innovative, you have to get used to that really, really quickly. And you have to let it not bother you. Because A, not everyone can help you, and B, not everyone is necessarily interested in helping you, but that isn't necessarily a reflection of the value of what you're working on. Either it just doesn't connect with them, or you have not been able to frame what you're working on to connect with them. So first, just asking everyone and anything in terms of any organizations that you might know. In terms of kind of some more, not science of things, but in terms of the core things that you need to be able to reflect what it is that you're working on paper. So you need to have a 1 to 2 page proposal that actually outlines the project. And it should start out with kind of what the overarching summary is. This is what the project is, et cetera. This may be its overall impact. And then you should have some language about what it and or your history is. So what is going into this? Why is whatever it is valued? Why is it informed? Who is it informed by? What are the experiences? So some kind of history of that, if you will. And then the actual project description. What is it you're actually going to do with tangible, actual results? I'm going to do this. There's going to be a competition for Black and Latino musicians from the age of 12 to 18 years old, and we're going to invite 12 of them, and they're going to get scholarships and this amount of prize money and play with an orchestra, and that is what's going to happen, and here's where it's going to take place, and here are the artists that are going to be involved, etc. Right? So you want to be able to frame the actual project. And then you want to share, here's actually what I need to be able to do it, and you want to build out a basic budget. Now, online, there are tons of templates for all of these types of things. Project narratives, you can literally Google it because there's a bazillion of them out there. The Foundation Center is a great resource. There's a host of others that you can also, Board Source, as you're thinking about board development, is also a key source. In addition to that, then when you think about kind of traditional funding mechanisms, there tend to be 3: individuals, foundations, and corporations. So you want to think about what it is that you're doing and who might be interested in funding it. One of the best things to do is to look and say what organizations already exist that are doing something similar to what you're doing, and then absolutely go and raid their materials. If you are building a project that relates to diversity in the arts, I encourage you to raid Sphinx's funders. Look who's funding Sphinx, because they're probably entities that are interested in diversity and inclusion in the arts. And Sphinx isn't the only thing they fund. And so Sphinx wants to encourage the landscape of funders who are interested in these projects to grow. So that is something you should absolutely do, and you shouldn't feel afraid or wrong about doing that. And if you're building an orchestra, look to the orchestra, who's funding the current orchestras, et cetera. So if you will, don't reinvent the wheel in that. And that relates to corporations, foundations, or individuals as well. And then you reach out to them, their proposals, you want to go, you want to research your funders, you want to research and find out what their priorities are, what the process is to be able to apply to them. Go through that process rigorously. And then the last thing that I would add is that ideally, with a lot of those things that I'm describing, you're going to have to go in cold. And that's what I did for the inaugural year of Sphinx. I just sent out hundreds and hundreds of letters because it is in part a numbers game, especially if you don't have a network to build off of. So in some ways you have to do that, and Sphinx to this day has, if you will, a kind of numbers approach of just getting out to a huge number of people information about what Sphinx does, but then also very targeted relationships that it's built over time. And that part of that will just take time. And that leads to this last part, which is networking, which is a huge thing you can do today, right after this session, tomorrow, all of the time that you're here. There are funders here, so if you're interested in funders, I would look through and find out where the sessions where funders are on the panel. And as soon as that panel is over, I would be right up there and I'd be introducing myself and handing them my card and talking to them just briefly about what it is and asking, can we have 10 minutes for a coffee somewhere because I want to talk with them more. And if that's not possible, can I follow up with an email? I would do that with every single person here, or then I would talk with the people who might be in other leadership roles who you think might know someone who might know a funder and say, hey, can I get 10 minutes to talk with you about this project that I'm working on, et cetera. That networking component will deliver a much higher positive results level than the shotgun approach, right? But from my perspective, you have to do both. And even after 20 years, Sphinx still does both. But obviously the relationships develop, so that becomes more of what you do. But earlier on, you have to just reach out to as many people as possible. The last thing I'll say, literally, because this is not an exaggeration, Afa is here, she can attest to this, it would be driving anywhere, wherever it was. And I always see these buildings and they have corporate, names on them. Anytime I saw a corporation that I didn't recognize, I'd be like, Celestron, do we have them? We'd just jot it down. And as soon as I get home, I'd send them I'd research them and send them a corporate letter for Sphinx to support Sphinx. So I was constantly, so by the time Sphinx was just a couple years old, every major corporation in Southeast Michigan for sure had gotten a letter from Sphinx requesting funds. Because also with technology, you can do much of that for very, very little money. So does that help a little? Great, all right, cool, great question. Yes.
Yeah, we have a Slido question.
Slido, all right.
And it's from John Clare. And would you talk about the pros and cons of an organization of being a nonprofit or for-profit?
Great question. So nonprofit, for-profit. There are a number of kind of details related to corporate structures, which I encourage you again to just research, which again, a lot of times I'll say to research because a lot of general information, it's just available online. So just read it. Be intellectually curious about the world in which you want to delve into. So I would just say that for sure, and try and just gain as much information as possible. Which just as a side note, one of these, I love quotes, I'm always giving quotes, but this great quote from Gandhi, right? Which is live as if you're going to die tomorrow, but learn as if you're going to live forever. Right? So being a learning person constantly is something that can be of huge value. So for-profit and nonprofit, the cornerstone difference that I view between the two is whether you personally want to ultimately inure profit, as in some type of net value from what you create. So if you create a nonprofit, for example, I founded Sphinx, and after almost 20 years, then I left and transitioned to the University of Michigan. I couldn't sell Sphinx, right? I didn't, kind of get a paycheck for the public buying Sphinx, right? But if someone built Netflix or whatever, and after 20 years, they could probably sell it for $20 million or whatever. So the core thing is that in a nonprofit, no one builds value in it, if you will, financial value, right? The value belongs to the public. The value belongs to the community. So if you ultimately think you want to kind of sell something or develop something of value and then pass it on to someone and gain personal financial benefit, then you probably want to start a for-profit entity in some way. Because in a nonprofit, you can't do that, right? Board members can't own a part of it as opposed to board members of for-profit entities. However, with that said, oftentimes people are like, well, you know, nonprofit and I really want to earn a good salary. You can absolutely earn a great salary from a nonprofit. If you just look at people, forget about running them, but just, you know, people who, you know, are section players in major orchestras. Those are six-figure salaries working for a nonprofit, right? Many of the leadership CEO positions of nonprofits, including many, many, many arts organizations, are, you know, $200,000–300,000 a year. So you can earn absolutely a solid salary for the work you do for a nonprofit. So the difference is you're not building your own asset, you're not building your own value in it, but absolutely the organization can value your ongoing work. But then if you stop working for the organization, then that compensation would end. So I think that most of the time, I think a nonprofit structure is what is ideal for this final reason that I'll share, which is that if you have a for-profit, then you have whatever revenue lines you have that are usually from the various activities that you are doing. So it's called earned revenue. You're doing something, you're selling something, you're providing some type of service, you're earning revenue that you receive. As a nonprofit, you can have an unearned revenue. You can have contributed revenue, and that is money that you're getting from funders who are just simply giving you money without actually getting something of value in return other than the impact you're providing for the community, which is what they value and what they're really investing in you in. So in many ways, a nonprofit can simply give you an additional revenue line. So an orchestra, for example, if it was for-profit, right, it could just get its money from ticket sales, right, or and maybe record sales or, you know, broadcasts or things like that, only earned revenue. But if it's a nonprofit, then it can have contributed revenue. And oftentimes this changes drastically based on organizations, but oftentimes you might envision that, you know, a third of your revenue might be contributed revenue. And then you could have a third from earned and so on and so forth. So a significant percentage of what could be your revenue you would be giving up if you're not a nonprofit. And just to share again with nonprofit in terms of building that status is that you would develop a nonprofit corporation, and then you want to make sure you have a charitable solicitations license, usually for the state that you're founded in, but then you may need it for some other jurisdictions as well. But the core thing is filing what's called your 1023, but which is to get your 501c3 status. And we may even have some here who have founded organizations and who have actually gotten 501c3 status. Is there anyone here who has? Yeah, great, right. So it is a process that is not as difficult as you might think. And again, literally the forms are online. You can read through them. And there's lots of support sites that can help explain aspects of it to you. So hopefully that gives some depiction between for-profit and nonprofit status. So yeah.
Hello, I'm Clifton. I'm a music theorist, and as many of you probably know, in music academia, it has a lot of the same issues as classical music in terms of diversity. So several of my colleagues and I, like for the last several months, have been organizing a symposium to talk about some of these issues, like why underrepresented minorities have a lot of difficulty finishing degrees, getting tenure, things like that. And so the inaugural symposium is going to be taking place in November. It's going to be like attached to a larger national conference. But the questions I have are, what should we keep in mind for this this inaugural symposium? Because it's like, you know, we're trying to establish something that will be more long-term. What should we keep in mind in terms of how we're promoting ourselves, a balance of, I guess, trying to do as much as we can, but like not biting off more than we can chew so we don't come across as unprofessional. And then splitting our energy between short-term and long-term initiatives in terms of like having the symposium, which will which will happen over the course of 2 days, but then doing things like publishing a colloquy or starting some sort of coalition or something like that that'll have some sort of impact in between these different symposiums. Yeah, that's my.
Gotcha. Okay, great questions. And just let me know if there's parts that I haven't addressed or answered, and just let me know. So first of all, it's fantastic what you're doing and is hugely, hugely in need in our field. When it comes to kind of symposium and those types of projects or initiatives, the first thing that comes to mind for me is two areas of kind of building support to bring about sustainability. And one is thinking about the host. Because oftentimes for a symposium, or conference, or those types of things, building the value of the host institution, where it's held, because so many of the expenses involved in it really relate to the host. So if you can get space for free or house people for free and things like that, now all of a sudden that really can provide a host of things and take a huge fundraising burden off of you, which is a huge thing of finding in-kind support, in-kind funding. Partners who are providing things that you need as opposed to just money. Because now you don't need to raise money to house everyone if you actually have a host hotel, right? So many organizations and organizations like Sphinx, you will see, have hosting partners which help to absolve those costs. So thinking about how you are and or could be of greater value to your host institution. So when you think about partnerships in our field, thinking about what are the needs, for example, of a music school or of a performing arts school? Well, one of the things that they care about is recruitment. That's a cornerstone. So is what you're doing going to help bring people to campus who they might want to recruit as students or as potentially faculty? So things like that, and thinking about how are we of value, and thinking then about how can we make that case to the host institution and further that value, and that hopefully then we can then go to the host institution and say, could you provide more to help whatever it is that we're doing? The second is kind of the idea of membership organizations and looking and saying, are we of enough of a group where if we combine our resources and we say, look, let's all actually really delve in and put in, $100 or $200, whatever it might be, that combined, what will that enable us as a group to be able to do? And so thinking about ways that you can increase the value of your combined efforts in a way that will benefit everyone. And again, provide some type of funding stream for you. And then the third is to see if there's any other industry aspects. Is there aspects of the recording industry or in the publishing industry, or does ASCAP, BMI have an interest, right? Who have absolutely, ASCAP has supported Sphinx significantly, to say part of what we're doing here is being able to provide an impact for these other entities, and then would they potentially have an interest in supporting or funding us? Did that address? Was there? Yeah, no, definitely. Let me know if I have not hit the mark here.
No. Yeah, I don't want to take up too much time, but in terms of the host institution, it's a bit limited because the largest symposium is taking place in a certain place, and we have worked with. It's going to be in San Antonio, so we're working with UTSA, and so I mean it's a little limited in terms of like where we can host it, but we've been able to get. Yeah, sorry, we're gonna.
Why?
Because we think that it's best to have it before because there's the American Musicological Society and the Society of Music Theory, and for these events, like you get like a combined total of like 4,000 people, and we think it's easier to convince people to come a day early to our symposium and then stay for that as opposed to fly out to our thing.
Yeah. So. Great, and this is why I asked this question. So first of all, that's a very great strategy to have and is important. And when Sphinx was developing SphinxCon originally, which is what it was before it became SphinxConnect, one of the things at Sphinx that we thought about is, should we position it ahead of some other major conference? Is there some way we can combine? Because then everybody's there. We don't have to try and bring everybody. So it's a very, very good strategic thought to do. And I would encourage all of you as you think about your projects to think about them pragmatically in these strategic ways. I would encourage you to think also about, in a very short term, that definitely makes a lot of sense. And if you're able to translate those 4,000 people into engaging in your symposium and building that, phenomenal. And one of the things I always encourage people when they're doing this is to always constantly assess and evaluate. How is what we're doing working? Because if it's not working, we should shift it, right? So SphinxCon wasn't necessarily in its ideal position. And so AFA, for example, looked at it and said, are there ways that we can evolve this? And that's what led to this evolution to SphinxConnect. Right? And so over the period of just a couple years, it more than quadrupled the number of participants and attendees and a host of things and impact and sessions, and the list goes on and on. So I would just encourage you, as you move forward, to think about that and to balance and to list what the priorities are. Venue, initiatives that we want to have coming out of it, what's the ultimate impact we want to have, and how do these various criteria fit into that. So as we come and partner with these other existing conferences, is that providing what we need in terms of our own ultimate goals? And if you ever find that it doesn't, never be afraid to reassess and to rethink things. Mm-hmm. But great projects that you're working on.
Very great, thank you.
Yep, thank you. Hi.
Hello. I think one of the things that is intimidating for some of my students around entrepreneurship is this idea that they have to build an organization from scratch, which you've done, but you've also done other things. Could you give an example of an entrepreneurial project that you actually took to an institution when you saw something that an institution was missing and you were able to create value within an existing institution in an entrepreneurial way?
Yeah, so absolutely, and definitely a great point. That you don't need to actually build, and if you don't want to spend, because it is very time consuming, build a whole separate organization. You should absolutely either with your existing organization say, hey, is there something that we can build here, or take an idea and just bring it to some institution that you think might have an interest. And I'll be frank with you as well, that in the earlier years of Sphinx, I wasn't convinced that I could or really should build the organization independently to have the ultimate impact that I wanted. And so I brought Sphinx to a larger institution to say, hey, what about these ideas? Thankfully, because it was the early years, that organization said, forget about it. And so that, of course, only made me more driven. So, but I absolutely thought, because I was thinking strategically, how on earth is Sphinx going to be able to ever have this kind of budget? How are we going to be able to garner these kinds of resources like some big institution? But the reality is that potentially you can, but it does take time. An example of kind of doing that, well, actually, I can think of something just most recently in terms of serving as dean at Michigan. And so looking at that, I was looking at the field of chamber music, which we had a phenomenal session earlier today, led by Matt, about chamber music in the field. And so we were looking at that, and of course, one of the things about chamber music is all these hybrid groups. And so the reality is, if you talk with chamber music, and you look at Chamber Music America's membership listings, is the vast majority of new groups over the past 5 years are not traditional chamber groups, right? They're not string quartets and wind quintets and so on and so forth. They're odd hybrid, of which several were reflected on this panel today. And so he looked and he said, there's no major chamber music competition that is reflecting what is really the future of chamber music in our perspective, and taking all of the breadth of the chamber music field into account. And is that something that A, would be important for the field, and that B, our institution, the University of Michigan, could take a leadership role in being additive to the field and furthering the field. And so that then began these discussions of, well, how would that look and what would this look like? And that led to Emprise. So that was an example of building it in that particular capacity that I had in the institution. But I would say whatever it is, when I go back to my childhood, when I was at the Interlochen Arts Academy, right, this was where styrofoam was the big thing. We were like, we have to get rid of the styrofoam. And there was styrofoam all over the school. So me and a couple of friends started an initiative that we ended up taking to the president of the institution so that we could get styrofoam banned. So whatever it is, and no matter what your role is in an institution, you can bring about change. And you can use entrepreneurial skill sets to further something that it might be. So those are just a couple examples. Great questions. Thank you. Yeah.
Hi.
Hi.
Last night you spoke about how you have this trusted group of people that you go to for feedback and advice when you're looking to do some idea vetting. And I'm just curious to know, what are the criteria when you're assembling that kind of trusted tribe of people, and how do they maintain your trust?
Great question. So first and foremost is they have to be someone who will tell me the truth and who will be honest with me, and where the nature of my relationship, whether it's actually a super close relationship where I'm talking to them all the time, or where I only talk with them several times a year, but where I know the nature of our relationship and their personality is such that they will be like, that's a terrible idea. They have absolutely no reluctance whatsoever to be like, I think that's a terrible idea, and here's why. So that is first and foremost. Second, yes, there is the aspect of trust that they're not going to go and kind of talk about the project to other people, or where I can trust them in what I'm saying. But interestingly, that's a little less, because from my perspective, that's kind of with anyone who I intentionally spend time with or interact with, has that quality. I don't like to spend time with people that I wouldn't just trust on a normal level, if you will. So unless I just have no choice but to interact with them because of certain work situations, I tend to just avoid interacting with people that I don't find trustworthy. The additional aspects that I would say relate to the particular project that I'm thinking about. So there are people who are part of this group who I might raise questions about starting a competition with, but who I wouldn't necessarily ask about starting a game design company in particular. So I also look to say, okay, what am I trying to build here, and who knows the most about it? So and then I also value their opinion associated to that, right? So if I'm looking at something and I'm saying, okay, here's something that I want to do related to, the aspect of how we incorporate cello into emprise or into this chamber music setting. If I'm, having a discussion or reaching out to Yo-Yo Ma, that opinion is going to carry a massive amount of weight. Whereas at the same time, if I'm reaching out to someone who might be, the CEO of a bank, I'm not necessarily, I may get their feedback about some kind of organizational structure, but I'm not necessarily going to value their feedback about, something related to an artistic nature related to cello. So, so it's based on those types of things. But what I would say is to build that type of network takes time. And this goes along with the whole approach of kind of being intellectually curious. And when you're in settings like SphinxConnect, talking with people, developing those relationships, because then that's what helps to develop that network. So the people who I'm able to call on, those relationships didn't start with the intent that I would be able to call on them for that particular project. It was a relationship that existed in my kind of ecosystem. And then I had the opportunity to call upon them when a particular initiative arises. So it's not an opportunistic relationship, but one rather of a constant basis, if that makes sense. Cool. Is that helpful? Yes. Great. All right. Thank you. Yeah. Slido.
Yep, another Slido question. All right, so this is from Carlos Garcia Leon. And the question is there a reason why Sphinx and a lot of other arts organizations are not using the term Latinx?
Sorry,
Is it Latinx or Latinx?
oh, Latinx.
Latinx?
Yes.
Okay, sorry.
I think, unless I'm wrong, Sphinx does. And actually, Afa might be able to speak to it. I like not to speak about the things that are currently underway at Sphinx. Yeah. Yeah. So, and it's a great question because, you know, it really kind of relates to identity, and it also relates to terminology. And so what I can say in terms of the entirety of the history of Sphinx is that there has been a constant evolution of identity terminology, but also programmatic practice terminology, right? So for example, when organizations used to do work in the community, it used to be called outreach. And that's what everyone said. And then over time, that evolved into community engagement. And there's all these types of reasons for those types of things. But I would say what is critically important for organizations, and I definitely feel like Sphinx has done this and continues to, exactly as Afa just described as it relates to Latinx, but to always be listening and be aware of what's happening in the community. And if there are changes that are occurring, to be open to potentially evolving what you as an organization have done. This is one of the things actually that I cannot stress enough, especially in our field for some reason. And it kind of astounds me in our field because we're artists. But there are many organizations that become very staid. They become very committed to the way in which they've done things. People often talk about orchestras this way, but it's a host of organizations, including our educational institutions. And we've done it this way. We've thought about things this way. And no, we are not just going to change. And the interesting thing is that change happens, and it will. And the organizations that don't change falter. And they get superseded by those that become more relevant. So in 5 years, the organizations that are not using Latinx are not going to be embraced and engaged by the community. And that's just one, you know, example of that. But organizations that, for example, just kept saying, we're doing outreach. We're coming here into Detroit to do outreach. And that really bothered a lot of people, rightfully so, in the community. Those organizations, those programs didn't fare so well. But this also goes to the way in which you think about it. I believe that this is an aspect of chamber music. I think the institutions that don't understand and embrace and make available opportunities for all of the hybrid and innovative things that are happening in chamber music will be unable to be at the forefront of chamber music 5 years, 10 years, 20 years down the road. And all we have to do is look at anything in life, and we can see that progression. So we know it occurs, but when you're at the moment of change, it doesn't feel right, it doesn't feel comfortable. So organizations always have to not only be open to change, but actually reaching out to understand what is the change that's going on. So that was a really interesting question. So yes, hi.
Hi, good night. My name is Isis Collier. I'm from St. Thomas, Virgin Islands. And in the Virgin Islands, there is more focus on the band instruments and the steel pan. And so I was wondering, what would you say that should be done to improve the focus on string instruments in the schools / developing a stronger one?
I would think that if you were able to develop an initiative to lead that would probably be fantastic. Why do you think they aren't as much a part of the offerings or the ecosystem currently?
Currently, from experience, I would say it's the financial to keep a well-trained string teacher on the island to teach students of strings, because there is the willingness to learn the string instrument. However, we have the lack of funding / expertise in the string department.
Gotcha. So I would look at, and I would try and look at exactly that question and say, okay, what are the key things that we think are the biggest reasons or the biggest obstacles? Core teacher, the expertise, potentially instruments, starter instruments, et cetera. Probably access to recordings and all that might be there and so on and so forth, but if not, making sure, not just access, but curation of recordings and what to listen to and what music to engage with, what artists to engage with. And then to look at those sets and say, you know, if we could address maybe 2 of these 3, we could make a significant movement on that needle. And then begin to look and say, are there any existing institutions where maybe something could be hosted? Are there any artists or musicians who might even be here at SphinxConnect?
They actually did do a performance there.
Awesome.
over
And
December,
so, and beyond a performance, but someone who might actually say, you know what, I would love to be able to come and take 9 months and spend in the community to have a transformative effect. I just need, you know, some housing and, you know, to be fed or those types of things, right? So again, when you're looking at something, you're like, and you look at it and you say, okay, here are the issues we have to address. If we look at that on paper, it's, you know, $60,000 for, you know, a teacher and, you know, another $40,000 for instruments, and then we've got housing and travel on top of that, so we've got a $130,000 budget. And you say, how are we going to raise that? And we're just getting started and people aren't aware of it. Now, it could be that there are funding streams and opportunities, especially currently, that might be able to be accessed, but if you find they can't be, that's when you bring innovation, which I had mentioned from the dice, into it. And you say, okay, how could we get a teacher without $60,000? Are there teachers who would value the experience if they can be housed? Are there people in the community who would love to house a teacher because of the experience? And now you find that the shared values of what you're creating in the idea will enable people to bring their own assets to bear, their own personal capital to bear to enable the initiative to actually start. So those are just a couple of ideas.
Thank you
Great.
so much.
Thank you. Thanks so much. Hi. And then I think we have time for just this question and then one last question after that. Thanks.
Okay.
These are great questions. But is this helpful at all in terms of what people are? Okay, great. Okay, just wanted to make sure. Great. All right. Yes. Hi.
All right. I'm Naya. I am a cellist, and I do have a question for you. Yeah, I heard that woo over there. My question is, do you encourage music students to travel out of the country in order to explore more opportunities?
Absolutely, 1,000% yes. Yes. I think that the experience and the opportunity to practice further your art in other communities, in other cultures, is incredibly invaluable. And separate from kind of all the things that you would think, it gives you this experience and so on and so forth, and not only that, it is great on a resume and all of those types of things. But I think that very often, and I've seen this time and time again, that someone's art absolutely evolves when they're in that type of setting, when they encounter people and culture and habits that they may not have experienced before, because they can't help but let that inform their own art making. And that is how art evolves. If we only just look at it from the textbook standpoint, I think we keep ourselves limited. So I think that kind of experience is key, and Sphinx has Sphinx Global Scholars, where Sphinx brings artists internationally. I think currently it's 10 or 12 different countries, where they get to live in a community, they get to learn from that community, and they teach and perform in that community as well. So yeah, great question. Great, thank you. Hi, all right, I think our last question. I think unfortunately we are out of time. Yeah, sorry.
Okay, I'm going to try to move through it. My name is Susan Ayub. I'm an officer at the Detroit Federation of Musicians. I'm also on the American Federation of Musicians Diversity Committee.
Woo.
But before I was a union goon, I was a chamber musician. And in Detroit, what we did way back in the 70s was actually kind of groundbreaking. That was the Pastiche Wind Quintet. And we did things that are boring now, but we did things like we played in shopping malls and we played in banks and we played, that was just not very heard of at that point. Another thing we did is we had a residency in the Dominican Republic, not in Santo Domingo, but in the middle of the country as a community engagement, shall we say, situation. So I'm telling you all this to introduce myself to you, but also to say how much I'm so glad to be here. I've heard about Sphinx forever, never had, I don't know, the invitation to be involved. So I'm so happy to be here.
Oh, great.
So my question is totally different than that, but when you were talking about would you recommend nonprofit organizations or profit? I'm the secretary treasurer at the Detroit Federation of Musicians, and this type of thing I've been very concerned about. Have you had a chance to evaluate the recent changes to the tax code vis-a-vis impact on contributions to nonprofits?
Yes. So,
maybe I'll just say one other thing too.
yeah.
The Pastiche Chamber Players was a nonprofit. And at the union, we have a nonprofit called the Detroit Musicians Fund, which is there to help musicians who are fallen on hard times, the medical problems, whatever, and also to give scholarships. So, I care about this.
Yes, absolutely. So it's a great question, and the reason just why I'm hesitating is because I don't want to get into the details of the tax code in this forum. I think it's probably not ideal, and Af may want to add something to this, but to share that. So certainly overarching everything, my sense of for-profit and nonprofit hasn't changed, and I still think that overarching everything that there is an ideal pathway through nonprofit status. And of course, which is really funny, right, that literally a whole field is defined by what it's not, right? So this is something that people often talk about, like, why is it nonprofit, right? Shouldn't it be for impact, right? And or, so others have utilized various terms, but that it is ridiculous that we define an entire field by what it's not rather than what it's for, which in some ways I think, unfortunately, just as a communications strategy, has enabled it to be negatively impacted, which of course the sector is by this new current tax changes, evolution. But my short answer is that no, I still do believe that the overall strategy of nonprofit still stands even in this new structure. But Af, did you want to just add something? Yeah.
Yeah, I'll project now. Would be to go on the Americans for the Arts site, which keeps us all current and it digests good information about impact of the new tax code upon not-for-profits or for-value organizations. The recent 2 postings were really helpful to digest. I do agree it's probably not the forum, but it greatly breaks down how much we do and what don't know. I think what's important is to not, the only thing I'll say is it's important not to get into the euphoria of fear of what's going to happen to philanthropy for not-for-profits, because there's a lot we don't know. That would be a good thing. The other thing for us locally and regionally, another really amazing resource is Creative Many Michigan. I'm totally doing a plug because I sit on their board, but Sarah Triplett, who was on the panel earlier, knows a lot about this. So she's a real authority, and she wouldn't kill me for putting anyone in touch, because there are folks who really study the policy versus politics piece, a lot of what was the conversation earlier today, and they can do a better job explaining. They're more of an authority in that piece. So I think it's just important, whenever something impactful like that occurs and it really changes the landscape, I'm always loath to saying, these kind of conversations I think are best off withheld, because it's important that the wrong impression doesn't go out there and send everyone in a frenzy. I think we know some, we don't know enough. For example, one of the main things Sarah will probably tell you is that while there's going to be change, there's a predicted change because of the write-off system being different. What we don't know is how much that's going to be offset by the growth in economy. So before we panic, we should talk to the experts. And those are my two resorts.
And I would like to say the last thing I want to do is encourage people to panic.
Yeah. There you go. No, you're not definitely.
Yeah.
I just want it
And-
in the family setting. Those are amazing resources. They can tell a better story. Terrific.
And I feel so bad.
that's not you. Okay,
And I feel so bad too to just let one last question, because I know you were there and you wanted to ask. So I want to just let this one last question asked, and then we will wrap up. Thank you all so much for all of these fantastic and amazing questions. Hopefully it's been helpful. And please continue to view Sphinx and me as a resource moving forward. Beyond the conference and beyond Connect. So feel free to be in touch with Sphinx, with anyone at Sphinx, or with me as well. So yes, last final question.
Thank you, Aaron. I really appreciate this. Okay, so my question is actually in terms of dreaming big and keeping, so whenever you achieve something that's really big and part of like your dream to do and it happens, what do you do, especially because with Sphinx now we're here in Detroit at this conference and this is huge, you know, and being sponsored by Mercedes. How do you keep your mind expanding, and how do you keep that like single, keep on dreaming big? You know, instead of like settling, I don't want to settle, so I want to keep my mindset on expanding, and what do you have for advice for that?
Yeah, so great question, and absolutely, I am in a constant state of that, and I think everyone should be. And so I would go back to what I mentioned about being intellectually curious. So I am just simply curious about the world around me, and I'm passionate about it. So whether it is political issues, or whether it's various new books, or whether it's gaming or cryptocurrencies, right? Or these types of things. I'm intellectually curious about things that are happening in and around the world. And so oftentimes that provides this ongoing sense of looking at those things. And I'm also always looking and saying, what is the best role for me to play in those things? So for example, there came a time where looking, given the opportunity and some of the interests and needs that I saw at the University of Michigan, was that role that I used to play with Sphinx, that no longer needed to be. So in looking and constantly, I think, being open to those new ideas that surround you. And just to say that I absolutely make this a process in my life. So in other words, I have very specific things that come through in terms of email prompts, things like that, news feeds that I get, those types of things, so that I have a constant influx of information. Flipboard that I use as well, so that gives me especially a breadth of input into different things. So I don't just get arts and culture from the New York Times, every day. I get tech, or those types of things, or I get a specific Flipboard that gives me a host of different things related to even space research and things like that. So I have an influx so that I have to tamp down new information. And probably the last thing I'd say is that with our ability these days easily through social media to curate what we hear, because many of these companies, the way that they best work is to provide and share information that they already know you want. That can create a tunneling where it becomes very easy to not hear about new things, to not learn new things, and most importantly, to not hear or learn other people's perspectives on things and opinions on things. And so I think whatever you can do to intentionally create those lines into your life is an important information source, and then be responsive to that. And I think in that way, keeping that big picture constantly unfolding. So in other words, my dreams when I was 5 years old and started on the violin were different than what my dreams were with the violin when I was 15 years old. Changed in terms of what my dreams were when I was 25 years old. And then that changed in terms of what my dreams were 10 years ago, and let's forget about how old I am right now. So, but my point is that my dreams are constantly in a state of evolution as well. They're not static. Great question. Thank you all so much. Please do keep in touch. Thank you. Thanks so much. Thank you. Thank you.